So my name's Austin Wiggins. I am a Korean linguist by military training, a futurist by sort of self-insertion into this space. And I work at a place called Air Force Cyberworks. What we do is we take problems from across the Air Force and we put our intellectual rigor behind them to try to solve them. We work in policy problems, in data governance problems. We kind of run a really interesting gamut between cyber and sort of what we can roughly call talent management. And so that's sort of where I've been working for the past about year and a half. I also am one of the leaders of an organization called Agitare, of which we have a few representatives here in this call. Agitare is a community of practice around facilitation, sense making, futures, sort of you name it, whatever capacities might be seen as on the fringe from a military perspective is what Agitare often finds itself the home of. So there's a lot of overlap in Agitare and AOD in that capacity. We just have a more explicit built out community around sharing tools, techniques with one another. So today I'm going to talk about futures. Okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about. There's an intersection that is often ignored as it relates to a futures practice. It's that intersection between futures and design, as well as systems. In the next hour and a half, my hope is to explore that intersection with you, and also to point you to some schools of thought that get you to further explore that angle yourselves, because what I'm going to tell you is but one perspective of many. In fact, some of what you'll hear today about futures is going to be what could roughly be called extremely French, as in I'm the one who developed the idea, and there's not a whole lot of validation in terms of within specifically the field of future studies around it. However, as I'll explain, there's a lot of validation in it within the social sciences, so I'm going to be making that bridge. Actually, continuing the tradition of social sciences into future studies. Before we get into any of that, I shared in the Discord a Miro board, and it has 3 questions. So you don't have to use Miro if you're unable to use Miro. You can use a notebook. I actually have a notebook where I do most of my writing these days. And in it has 3 questions. And I just want to sort of get us oriented to the idea of what it means to have a futures practice. So the questions are, what is the future? And they're obviously you're not being graded, so no right or wrong answers. But to hear that diverse thought about what it means to what is the future, right? Just to hear your explorations around that idea. How might you or might not you have a relationship with the future? And then lastly, what is your everyday experience with the future? Now, at this point, if somebody had access to the chat, it'd be really handy if you could put these questions in the chat. For some reason, I don't. But thank you, Ethan. But the questions are, again, what is the future? How might you or might not you have a relationship with the future? And then what is your everyday experience with the future? And I want to sort of honor this reflection and give it about 5 to 10 minutes of just putting some thoughts around it. I'll look at the Miro board to see where some people are thinking. If you think 10 minutes is too long, let me know at around the 5 to 7 minute mark, and we can probably stop sooner than later. But I think offering the space to honor this reflection about what it means for there to be a future and what is the nature of the future, and to explore that in a couple of ways would be really useful. So I'm going to give it until it's 10 on my clock. So I'll give it to, I mean, it's 10 on the minute. So I'll give it to 15 on the minute for everybody, and we'll see how we're doing. Okay, that puts us at the 5-minute mark. Would just give me a quick, nod of the head, raise of the hand if you need more time. Okay, does anybody want to share their reflections about what they've thought about this relationship with the future, the nature of the future, as it were? And you can feel free to just come up on audio.
Hey, Austin, sure, I'll share. So the first question, what is the future? I've spoken to you about this before, and I think there's many ways in which to explain it, but from one's perspective, I would say it was a series of deflection points between the present and a determined future, whether you cast that out into 5-10 years, whatever the scope may be. And then the relationship with the future, kind of for me, I broke it down into aspects within my control and then aspects outside of my control, and how the ones that are outside control may be just things we prepare for, uncertainty, those types of things. So that's sort of the relationship there. And then the everyday connection, I was struggling to come up with some wide ideas about it, but more particularly, I just thought of my daughters when thinking about my everyday connection with the future, and they're kind of my visual representation of future that I am delighted to deal with every day. So those are my 3 answers.
No, absolutely. I'm going to hear some other thoughts about it too, but I want to really highlight that last point of there are some things that are whether that be for biological reasons or designed reasons, people or things that are representative of the future, right? Your daughters, my son, are a representation of the future because we understand how this biological process works, and eventually we will die and they will be a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old, depending on how lucky we are and for how long we live, that they're going to have to deal with whatever we leave undone, essentially. Now, that's not just the case for biological beings, but there are design things that are equally a representation of the future. There are things designed, a decade or two ago that we are still using today. And in that same way, it becomes a representation of the future. Would anybody else like to share their reflections thus far? I see David Major with the hand raised.
Hey, everybody. Good to see everyone. Happy pre-holidays. So what is the future? Kind of looking at the future, we also have to kind of look at the past, right? So I see a time of setbacks, self-correction, and a time when multiple so I guess it's the humanity along with nature and events. The system's always trying to correct itself. Even though when we're living in the present, things seem to be chaotic. But if you step back and kind of look at broad scope of history, it's exciting, right, for self-correction and self-organization. And my dealing with the future is I'm with military, professional military education. So that kind of keeps me looking forward to the future and a better way to educate Marines and what technology provides for that, and the different ideas that I get from my design friends. And I think what was the last one was my everyday experience with the future. Well, just trying to keep up with all the different advancing apps in technology, which is I'm kind of challenged with that aspect. So that's my everyday experience. That's all I have, everyone.
No, absolutely. Thank you, David. There's a real feeling, there's a real necessity, I should say, of looking at the future as a continually emerging thing, right? Without being able to look at the future as something that expresses emergence in this way, we become forced to look at the future as something that is static, that if we just build the right model, we will always be able to predict the future, which if our history of physics and mathematics tell us anything, it should tell us that because of the nature of nature itself, prediction in the long-term sense is more or less a fool's errand. I would like to open the floor for one last person, and then I'm going to give some ground rules of how this next part's going to go, and then we'll move forward. Anybody else? Ethan.
Morning, afternoon. In case I don't see you, good evening and good night. I dropped a bunch of stuff, links into the Miro board, more than I will spend time talking about, so don't worry. What is the future? I think understanding fundamental principles and then building on those simple rules rather than like trying to give a prescriptive definition of this is I think the boundaries are always fuzzy. And so trying to understand, so there's an environmentalist in Minnesota who published a tract, 10 Principles for Futures Thinking. It's like, I go to that when I'm trying to teach people how to think about the futures. And the first principle of what is the future is that the future is plural. So like other principles like that. Cuss mentioned something about, growing and growth and especially adolescence. And in the context of the talk, right, I heard like sort of our traditional planning processes failed us. And there's a really excellent book called The Gardener and the Carpenter about like, what is the mental metaphor that we're using? Are we carpenters with a design that we're trying to build towards, or are we gardeners like creating an environment in which like growth is possible? So I think that mental metaphor for like, where are we going in the future is powerful and important. The relationships that I have with the future, I'm a consultant mostly for Air Force teams. My everyday experience with the future is helping that group think about where the future of national security interests might be going. And in that, Ray Dalio's new book, Principles for the Changing World Order, is just like very powerful. The set of metrics that he's using to track trends and where large scale environmental factors might be taking us. And then the conversation about meta crises that was shared in the Agitari channel has been on my mind a lot, both as I raise a child and I think about, my own future, my own health and well-being. So too many references there to say like there's one definition for this, but lots of different angles to attack the problem.
Thank you for sharing, Ethan. I want to sort of emphasis one aspect of what you said, which is when you deal with anything, but specifically when we're dealing with this aspect of futures, we have to accept the fact that as I'm presenting this, it is going to be filtered through my own experiences, through my own navigations in the space. It'll in some ways be limited. It'll some ways be more expansive than you think should be within futures as a practice. That's okay. When we talk about the nature of the future, a future without multiple perspectives is, again, that same linear mechanistic view that we know isn't the case with nature in the future. So I just wanted to reemphasize that what you're going to hear is going to be from the perspective of one consultant who has established a futures practice in an organization over the course of the last year and a half. It is informed by, my study at Arizona State University, also known as ASU if you're not familiar, and my own practice as it's developed over time. But it is but one perspective of many, and I will mention other perspectives that people have, and in fact, how you might be able to come to understand other perspectives from a futures perspective, given this high-level view that I'm going to give you today. Before I talk about what that high-level view is, I want to give a couple of ground rules. One that's particularly for myself, and then there'll be a couple for you all. The ground rule for myself is that I'm going to speak slower than I am comfortable with. I understand that this is an international audience. Not everybody's first language is English. I have a tendency to just start speeding off really fast with my language once I start getting excited. I know, as somebody who knows 2 other languages, is working on their third, that aspect of a native speaker starting to get really excited about a topic that they're talking about can make it really difficult to understand what they're saying. So to accommodate, because I have some degree of empathy with that experience, I will do my best to speak slowly. On the other side, though, if you notice that I am starting to speak too fast or you don't understand something that I have said, please use the hand raise reaction, come up on audio, ask the question, ask for clarification. I want this, as much as I am going to be talking about this, to be as back and forth as possible, as much of an interaction between me and you all as possible. So with those ground rules established, I wanted to give an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. And what we're going to be talking about today, we've already sort of oriented around some ideas of what the futures are going to be. I'm going to help orient from the perspective that I'm using a couple of definitions, using perspectives of some authors who are in various degrees of eminence in the field. And then after that brief orientation around, futures and a futures practice, we're going to use a lens on futures practice that you've probably never seen used before. I'm going to be using the lens of Larry Laudon's research traditions to talk about what a futures practice is. And I'll talk about what a research tradition is also, just to level set. And so we're going to use the perspective of research traditions to talk about why futures, what utility does it bring, why is it different than potentially some other disciplines. And once we are done filling out, this is going to be the bulk of today's talking about research traditions and talking about futures as a research tradition, which we can call a futures research tradition. After we're done talking about that, we're going to go into the relationship between futures practice and design, which is really the cross-section that I want to mention. As we talk about some of the factors within this lens, we'll also see from a certain lens how systems play into this conversation. Systems, futures, design is, again, the intersection that I hope to hit on within some degree of thoroughness, we'll call it. I wanted first to synthesize some of what we heard in reflections, right? Cuss had mentioned this idea of focus on the things that are in my control versus the things that aren't in my control. Well, there's an author called last name is Bell, B-E-L-L. First name, I believe, is Wendell Bell. And he was a he was a sociologist who at the time was focused really on development and nation building, who ended up getting into a futures practice through dealing with people, I believe, in the West Indies. What happened as he was dealing with people in the West Indies is that he realized that people's views of the future, like nation building is a great example of how nation building or how futures really inspires people to incite change, to make change happen. And so in his book, basically the fundamentals of future studies, one of the seminal books around futures, details a lot of things about a futures practice. But what I wanted to mention about what Cuss had brought up was that he mentions that as people, like our fundamental actions that we take about the future are usually one of two things. One of it is a control perspective, right? We make plans to try to guarantee that a certain future happens, right? I make plans to, for instance, have a good holiday season by making sure that I have all of this equipment that I need or all of this X that I need to ensure that. That is with a heavy underlying assumption that there is a tomorrow or a next day after that for me to plan for, right? There's a degree of control or of at least wishing for control that is inherent in us as people, that we use in order to have this ongoing relationship with the future. But there's this other aspect that Cuss brought up of things that are absolutely not in our control. What do we do then? Well, this is where we see our adaptive mechanisms start taking place, right? We can't plan for things that we can't adapt to things that we can't plan for. I'm sorry. It's hard to adapt to things, period, right? Just in general, adaptation is a hard thing to do, but especially as we mention, what are things that are out of control or out of the scope of our ability to plan? How do we adapt to something when we can't plan that well? And we're going to bring up this aspect of anticipation a little bit later. When a lot of people think of futures, they think of anticipation. I promise that is coming, but there's some groundwork to be laid. And so using Wendell Bell's perspective here of control on the one hand and sort of adaptation and preparation on the other, we start to get the first view of what it means to have a futures practice, right? There's one era of history when we look at the development of future studies as a practice that is heavily around military planning, strategic planning, just planning in general. Your various planning practices have come in contact with the thing that we now know as future studies. There are other aspects that we'll mention, including the idea of anticipatory systems that aren't necessarily planning, but they're how we adapt more in the more immediate realm. And I'll do a brief overview on anticipatory systems here in a second. So with that sort of level setting done, futures being this idea that our relationship is both, in this one perspective, control and preparation, adaptation, however you want to form that. Are there any questions? Because what happens from here on is going to be some detailed references to academic work, but I want to make sure that we have a common understanding about sort of this idea that our relationship with the future is both in the realms of planning, but also in the realms of what we can reasonably anticipate, and the various factors that will come into that as we talk about it. Any questions before we move on? I see one question. Yes, sir.
Yes. So I'd like to know how do you see futures practice and how that is different from foresight?
Yes.
Or is that the definition of foresight?
Sure. When we talk about foresight, there's a really interesting game of definitions that happens. So we'll be like, okay, so what's foresight? What's futures? What is, so on and so forth. For the purposes of how I'm going to talk about it today, they are interchangeable. They are the same. What I'm talking about as a futures practice is effectively foresight. That is just for ease of communicating this idea across the board. There are going to be some definitions that you'll run into that will say that that's not the case. A little bit later on in the presentation, we'll get into in what ways from an ontological and epistemological perspective of how different practices of futures emerge, and like what distinguishes one from the other. But just to level set, right now I'm using them synonymously.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay. So what I want to do is...
Sorry, there's a hand up. Timmy.
Oh, I see it, yes.
Yeah.
Timmy.
Yeah, hi. Just a question on, if you believe there's a difference between the anticipatory nature of futures and designing and influencing a future of your choice, like creating a future or simply anticipating a future that is outside your control and preparing for that.
Yes. So at the end of this, I'm going to bring up the cross-section of futures and design, and it is exactly for that reason. Because there's a degree of anticipation, right? There's also a degree of trying to will the future a certain direction, which is usually brought about by the design of a thing. And that could be a thing being a product, thing being a policy. Anything that can be reasonably designed is what I'm talking about when I mention design. So a quick peek behind the curtain is that they're so entangled that I think it'll be difficult to make a significant distinction between, what is anticipation, or what are we building because we are anticipating something. But I will flesh that out as we get into some of the more theoretical constructs that we'll talk about here. I'm going to now share. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now because I have an alternative angle that I want to introduce, just in case what I brought up wasn't clear. And this is me calling a quick change on how we can do this, or on what I had planned, but that's okay, because I think it's useful to have this lens also. I'm going to pull up a diagram that I perpetually keep nearby. So hold on, let me collapse some things. So some of you might have heard me present this specific aspect of the futures. If you have, I guess I'm sorry. But it is really important to look at it also from this angle, in that when I talk about a futures practice, it's, I believe, impossible to distinguish it from the ways that we navigate through inquiry as a human species, right? We ask questions about things, and by trying to answer those questions is how we learn about the world. This is our basic practice of inquiry. Research, as many of you know, because of the general background of people here at AOD, know that research is structured inquiry. And so what we've done is we have structured so that we are able to better define and measure these objects of research, so that we can more definitively say whether or not the question, that the answer to the question that we are looking for is valid or not. There are different types of research. Within the realms of research, I place futures within exploratory research. And what exploratory research effectively is, this is just a quick summary rather than like a detailed explanation of what exploratory research is trying to there's research where you basically understand what a problem context is, and there's research when you don't understand what problem context is or need to even explore what people believe the problem context is before you can even start to try to solve a problem. And this is roughly the area where I put a futures practice in. It is connected in ways to, I put UXR here, but just so that everybody can level set here, is user experience research. There is an inherent connection, I can't spell today for some reason. There's an inherent connection from a methodological standpoint of things that happen in user research and things that happen in a futures practice, because they're both about understanding problem contexts or like the situation in which a problem occurs rather than just the problem itself. The fundamental difference is the nature of which time perspective you're using to conduct this research. So from a user research, a user research or user experience research perspective, you're looking, past, present. Past, you're looking for historics. Present, you're looking for how people experience things. Whereas futures as a practice runs the whole gamut of how we currently understand time, past, present, and future. Now, I'm not going to show my full hand here, but another way to describe futures then is as a practice of using our understanding of the future to inform a practice of some sort. A research practice, for example. It is understanding at what fundamental levels, at what ontological levels, for example, that we know the future, and then using that to inform a practice of some sort. And this is where we see some really interesting divergences as it relates to a futures practice. You see things like designed futures, for example, or futures literacy by Riel Miller. These are not differences necessarily in understanding the future. They're differences in the way that understanding informs practice. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. There'll be more screen sharing, but I wanted to give that alternative perspective of what a practice is, which is using that understanding of a future to inform a practice, and that is understanding from an ontological level. And now what we're going to get into is Larry Laudon's idea of a research tradition, because this is going to be the lens that we are going to use to frame what I mean by a futures practice and what do you research when you research futures, and so on and so forth. Larry Laudon was, I believe he's passed away within the last decade, actually, but sort of when you go through academic literature, you don't really check when somebody has died, which is a fun aspect to think about. But anyway, Larry Laudon was an American philosopher of science. He did a lot of work around improving on Kuhn's concept of paradigms. He felt that there was scientific paradigms. He felt, and others actually along this tradition had felt, that there was some incompleteness on how Kuhn had formulated these scientific paradigms, in that he mentions a lot about, he being Kuhn in this case, sort of the macro theoretical level, or the macro and micro and macro theoretical levels, and a lot was spent sort of at the micro level, talking about what methodologies might fit within certain scientific paradigms. But there was enough of a consensus across the scientific literature that there wasn't enough spent sort of at the meta or the macro theoretical level to say, what is it that creates gravity within a paradigm that says this thing that you're doing is too far outside of this paradigm, or what you're doing fits within this paradigm, even given the deviance. So the first person that formulated an alternative to Kuhn's scientific paradigms was their Greek, I believe, last name Lakatos, Lakatos. And what they developed was this idea called research programs. And what a research program is it starts to get at that meta theoretical level, effectively saying that there are two significant aspects of a research program. One is a negative heuristic, effectively saying these are the things, whether that be like ontological constructs or epistemological constructs. Here are the things that you cannot do within this tradition, or it generates a pull away from that tradition. It effectively starts to represent another research program. And then positive heuristics, which is there is still room for deviance of doing something different, of changing this tradition in certain significant ways. Now, bringing back Laudan, Laudan, if I didn't spell it before, what Laudan did was build on top of this and establish this idea of research traditions. And there are different ways that you might explain what a research tradition is. For the exploration that we're going to do today, what I like to classify Laudan's work in research traditions is each research tradition has an ontology and an epistemology. So it effectively describes what you research, as in the object of the research, as well as the specific methodologies and specific methods therein of that research tradition. And to give you an example, and I see that Daniel's on, so maybe he can help me out with this. There's a research paper called Yuan Sheng, written by some Chinese researchers that actually came out, I believe, a couple of months ago. And Daniel, if you can pull the link to that into the chat, if you're able to, I would appreciate it. It's a long article that talks about the nature of systems in a lot of interesting ways. The reason why I reference this work is because it gives a really good example of trying to explain what it means for there to be a research tradition, in this case around systems. So this article codified a systems research tradition. They acronymed it SRT. And what the authors of this paper effectively said was that there's this author around systems called last name Bertalanffy, who had already done a lot of work in general systems theory around saying, okay, here's what systems are and how you study them, and then this is how you study them, right? So he effectively said, here's what a system is, effectively saying, okay, here's the ontology of what a system is, or here's the ontology of this tradition. And then here's how you go about studying systems. And Bertalanffy did this in a book called General Systems Theory. Normally when I'm by my desk, I would show the book that I'm referencing, but I am not by my desk today. It is a good book that effectively breaks down what is this thing that we call systems, and then therefore how do you measure them or research them, conduct any type of analysis on them. And then on the other hand, what are the practices that you can do? What are effectively the goals therein? But Daniel linked the article, so I'm not going to talk about it. I believe it's within the first 2 pages, if I'm remembering correctly, that it talks about Bertalan Fee's work and what it means to start building out this idea of a research tradition. For the purposes of carrying further, let's focus on the ontological perspective of what it is that we research, and this epistemological perspective, what or how we conduct research. Now, let's start with what, if you're familiar with futures as a practice, what you're probably most familiar with, because these are the easier things. These are things like horizon scanning, making scenarios, right? So for those who might not be familiar, let's start from the beginning. There's some conflicting academic opinion about how you start a futures practice. Some believe that you can start at horizon scanning, and I'll talk about horizon scanning for a second, but just for level set, is the practice of looking at various trends and other patterns within social, scientific, economic, political pattern, or within these political, social domains. I'll describe it in more detail here in a second, but just to level set. However, there are people like Andy Hines, who is currently a professor of, what is his title? He teaches future studies. I don't know what his title is, over at the University of Houston. That is here in America, in Texas. Now, according to Andy Hines, you start you start a futures practice at problem definition. And we'll see echoes of this idea as we bring back design and some of the work that Stuart Candy is doing at this intersection. Because it sounds very much like a design idea, as in, why would you start horizon scanning or doing any futures work if you do not understand the context of the problem that you're operating in? And so I bring up, from an epistemological standpoint, this work around problem definition that needs to be done from the perspective of Andy Hines and others who are saying you need to orient yourself around, if not a problem, at least the context or the environment of a problem before you go on to the next step, which is horizon scanning. For horizon scanning, every organization seems to have like a different method that they say is the way to do horizon scanning. I'm going to do my best to do the high level picture so I don't bias any one particular organization. Although I will be candid in saying that I am particularly biased towards the futures schools. Founded by, I can't think of their names right now, Yvette Salvatico and Frank Miller, I believe is his last name. Frank Miller. They do consulting work for futures, at least throughout the United States, although I think they're doing work internationally now. And so here's how you do horizon scanning, big picture. Horizon scanning is the process of looking at, we'll say, research papers, news articles, kind of you name the gamut of resource, right? That could be patents, it could be, secondhand compilations of interviews, for example. And what you do is you look for specific trends or patterns within what you're seeing. The best way to describe this is to use the framework of STEEP, which is STEEP. There are others. STEEP, in my opinion, is the most simple in terms of what the acronym is and what it stands for. STEEP, as in STEEP, stands for social, technological, and depending on which organization feels like ordering them, economic and environmental, and then P is political. sometimes they swap the E's. Sometimes it's environmental and then economic. But so social, technological, environmental, economic, political. So what you do is you look for patterns as you look through these newspapers, through these articles on the internet, through various research papers, and you try to uncover what is the trend here, what is the pattern here. I am struggling using pattern and trend synonymously. It's because the Futures School makes a distinction between the two, where the trend is more of your trend is more what you would expect in terms of like, your statistical trends, right? Whereas patterns are sort of the values, the values that underpin these trends. And I'll give you an example of what is meant by it. I think it's a really useful perspective to look at it in, but it shouldn't be the only way. We're seeing a pretty significant trend towards AI, especially in the realm of, we just saw the release of ChatGPT, I think it's called. What is it called? I think that's right. ChatGPT, and the really interesting things that it's able to do. So one way to look at this from a trend perspective is to say, okay, over the course of 10 years, we've seen a significant increase both in quality, but in the speed of production of these AI algorithms that are able to get better and better, able to handle natural speech. That is one way to look at it, and that is not a wrong way to look at it. It is reflected in statistical reality. But what that detriments you to is to look at, okay, but why is that happening? A trend, just like the difference between quant and qual, or quantitative data and qualitative data, quant doesn't tell you why. Quantitative data doesn't tell you why. It tells you that something is happening. It can tell you how much something is happening, but it fundamentally cannot tell you why something is happening. And so just in that same vein, to look at just the trend isn't enough. You have to figure out the why, which is what I refer to when I say a pattern. So what is the value or the pattern underneath this increase in AI capacity as it relates to, chatbots or whatever you want to call them? One of those values could be a classic Western society standard of a greater demand of efficiency. That is kind of just a common value and pattern that you see fueling a lot of our technological progress is efficiency gains in various ways. And in fact, you can see as ChatGPT has sort of gone through its quick hype loop at this point, how people were talking about the efficiency gains of using ChatGPT, and for instance, as a chatbot or as a way to get the wave tops of a specific paper that you were writing, which is something that me and I don't know whether to call this person a friend or a colleague, somewhere in between those two probably. Basically, I wrote the title of the paper and figured out what direction it wanted to go, and my colleague basically ran it through ChatGPT, and it ran a summary on it, or it basically wrote the paper. And the results were really interesting. They weren't wrong per se, right? And there's a lot about how wrong these things can be, but as it related to the material that we were talking about, it wasn't wrong per se. And so as we talked about the implications of what it means for an AI to be able to even write, a couple paragraph summary of what I was planning on writing about, we're still talking about an efficiency gain. It's just, in a different way, like what ways my academics use it to increase their efficiency in writing, for example. That's what I mean when I talk about the patterns below. And for a good book on understanding trends and patterns. I think a good starting point is Rita McGrath's Seeing Around Corners. It is not a perfect book by any means about this topic, but I think it is a great starting point that gets you thinking in the out of the realm that trends dominate and into where patterns dominate behavior more than trends. Now, of course, scenarios seem to be the primary way that futures work is communicated. In fact, even at my work at ASU, when I'm communicating the research that I've done, for example, around the futures, the possible futures of electric vehicles, especially in Arizona, we communicated them through scenarios. So what are scenarios, if you're not familiar? They are, I like to think of them as a means of creatively synthesizing research. So part of your research has already been done in the way of problem definition and horizon scanning. By doing those two things, you have gathered both quantitative and qualitative data. Using scenarios is a really effective way to synthesize this quantitative qualitative data through a creative output that lets you see things in a more divergent way. Because the purpose of a scenario, right? A scenario is writing about the future in some way, roughly, for definition's sake. But what they're good for isn't obviously for predicting the future, because we mentioned on the outset that the futures are plural, right? There are multiple futures. So trying to predict one, again, is sort of an impossible, almost Sisyphean type effort that you're never going to accomplish. The purpose of scenarios is instead to help to help uncover where there are opportunities for growth, or to avoid ruin in this, using this creative medium, right? So you use research and then you use stories informed by research to inform what are the possibilities within the space that we might not have been considering before. And we'll talk about in what ways our understanding of the future are limited, because from an ontological perspective, it gets really interesting in what ways we are limited, and to understand them is crucial to a practice. Peter Schwartz's book, The Art of the Long View, is probably the seminal book on the role that scenarios play in a futures practice. If you haven't read it, I 100% recommend it. He talks about how this was in the 60s, during the 60s or 70s, during the oil crisis of that time. And he was working as an analyst at Shell. And he talked about how they used scenarios to paint out what are the possible things that might happen that will affect, in this case, it was, Shell as an organization, whether that be their ROI in specific industries that they're in. What happened in their writing scenarios is that they realized that there was a possibility that that countries in the Middle East might start restricting their access to their oil, and therefore driving up the price of the price of gas here in the States, because he's American. So what that allowed Shell to do is, one, thrive in an environment where a bunch of other oil companies were severely impacted by the price of oil because of how the Middle East policy changed, but also is probably the start of why Shell is as I mean, for better or worse, considering it's an oil company. For better or worse, it is what led to Shell being the oil giant that it is today. And so it led to its near dominance in this realm, right? It is one of the, at least at one point in time, one of the top 3 oil companies. When people think of oil companies, they think BP, they think Shell, at least American companies, because I understand that there's a difference. But American oil companies, BP, I don't even know if BP, there's a whole implication there of me not understanding a bunch of things, but we won't talk about those things. When we talk about big oil companies, BP, Shell, I'm already having trouble thinking of a third, right? There's such a dominance in even those 2 companies that thinking of a third off the top of my head is actually pretty difficult. Obviously, there is a third and a fourth and a fifth, but thinking of what giants exist in this space off the top of my head is obviously those 2. And so that's what scenarios help you do. And ultimately, this is what a futures practice helps you do. It helps you determine it helps you expand what you think your left and right boundaries are. It helps you see, okay, before any of this work was done, we believed that our bounds were, like this, like, I don't know, like a 45-degree angle maybe, where actually they're far more vast than we think they are. And you can only do that through, well, one of the ways you can do that is through the application of scenarios that are formed by lived experience, that are informed by historical patterns, that are informed by trends and patterns. So that's the epistemological level. Those are the general practices that people use when we talk about a futures practice. Where things start to get interesting is in the ontology of things. And I'm going to share my screen one more time to the same diagram, because now we're going to talk about some specific ways to understand the future. I think I'm presenting okay. So the first way to understand the future is from an anticipatory perspective. Now, you can see this play out in a number of ways, but I'm going to refer to Robert Rosen's work on anticipatory systems, because what it does is it seems to unite both the planning and control perspectives that we started with at the beginning. And I am vastly simplifying Rosen's work on anticipatory systems. But for the sake of how future studies needs to see anticipatory systems, this is useful and functional. And what Rosen's theory on anticipatory systems shows us is that we have like in our head, we have models of reality, mental models. We run that when we are thinking of doing something, when something is afoot, we run a cognitive simulation, which makes us, okay, there's a predictive factor there, right? We are running simulations of what we think might happen if we did a thing. And then based on the outcome of that cognitive simulation that we are running, there results either behavior alteration, as in, okay, I saw something rattling in a bush and it was a snake that bit me. Now that's the cognitive simulation that I run. So now instead of trying to approach that bush, maybe instead I am walking away from that bush. Or maybe it was actually a predator in that bush, like a larger predator in that bush. And instead of walking away, I need to run away or run, some other direction. This is what effectively Rosen is getting at when he mentions anticipatory systems. We constantly run these simulations, which are effectively feed-forward systems. that alter our behavior about how we are going to approach the future. So this is one way that the future exists. It exists in our anticipation that something is going to happen or might happen. And how you see this reflected in sort of the traditions now used in the general way, not the specific way that I mentioned before, in the traditions of futures as a practice. You have, for example, anticipation, the anticipation conference that was hosted by ASU, I think, just a couple months ago. You see it reflected in Riel Miller's work. And Riel Miller was the former, I believe now, head of futures literacy at UNESCO. And so what Riel Miller's work in futures literacy helped us figure out as a futures practice community is to learn the degree in which anticipation plays a role in our understanding of the future. So I'd point to Riel Miller's work in fleshing out the anticipatory nature of it, right? One of the ways to then research the future is by understanding how people are anticipating the future. In what ways are people planning for the future? What ways are people afraid of the future, right? So we have practices, like I mentioned before, in problem definition, where I might actually just interview people who are affected by this problem context. Say I'm interviewing people about their opinions on electric vehicles and whether or not they'll buy one. This is one way that we start getting this view of how people are anticipating the future. How are people anticipating the growth of the EV market? How people are anticipating the infrastructural support of EVs within their cities. But ultimately, this is just one perspective, one ontological way that futures, the plurality of them exist. Usually, this is where people stop. Within the futures community, this is kind of where people stop. They're like, okay, anticipation is great. You can start talking about how people are feeling about the future, thinking about the future, preparing or planning for the future. And I see a hand raise, so I'll stop here for a second and let David ask the question that he asked. David?
Hey, thanks, Austin. Could you show your chart again that you were sharing before?
Absolutely. If I can remember how to share my screen real quick, sorry.
That's all right.
Keep switching between platforms, and it's like, okay, which sharing pattern am I using? Yeah, so I'm
right
talking
there.
about this top up here. We'll talk about the bottom part here in a second, but the focus right now.
So you're going to talk about the bottom part here in a second?
I am going to talk about the bottom part because this is where things get, we'll call it experimental. And actually, this is a really nice segue anyway. There is another way that the future exists, and that is in the structure of things. And we talked about design as a practice, right? Design is one way that things get structured. We design for a thing. It's kind of infeasible in a way to think that it is only our collective anticipation that is making our future. There is something that is fueling our anticipation. There's a role to be played in the things that influence our thinking that play into the future. So this is what I'm hinting at when I mention structural systems. There's probably a nicer name for it. I'm still looking for it though. And here's one way to look at it. Anticipation, or anticipatory systems, is the way that the present influences the possibilities of our multiple futures. Structures are the way that the past influences both our present and our future. And now I'll describe this process here at the bottom on how exactly it does that. And again, I have to mention that this is experimental. I have somebody who's not off mute. If there's a question to be asked, feel free to ask. If not, can you please go back on mute? Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the process here of how structural systems influence us and also how they influence the future. And we'll see how inherent the tie of design and a futures practice is. You already mentioned mental models, right? Rosin's work on mental models, including other work that had been done on mental models, including from the formulation of the idea of mental models, lends significant credence that to some capacity we have a representation of thoughts and ideas in our heads within some capacity. Well, those mental models inform our behavior. And so when we create something, whether I create, let's say I create an application, right? And it's a ride sharing application. There is already an inherent mental model at play here in just me saying that I'm developing a ride sharing application, which is a preference towards sharing or potentially getting paid for sharing your vehicle, as opposed to why would I share my vehicle when I own it, for example. Right. So in the design of an application, I am embedding, if I'm developing by myself or a team is developing or is embedding their own mental models in the structure. If what happens, which is typical for the tech sector, then it's usually some type of visionary type figurehead whose mental model effectively becomes the reality of this structural creation. And then what happens is people interact with it, right? They use it. Sometimes the structural creation changes. Well, it often does in the tech sector. Sometimes it changes, sometimes it doesn't. Kind of depends on which sector that you're dealing with. And in doing so, it helps make real, like outside of itself, that mental model. So for instance, Twitter is created as a platform with one person's mental models of how people should react. And now as people have interacted with it, an example of the way this mental model has been reified is through our language. Like we just now kind of accept to tweet as a verb in English, which is a representation of the various ways that a mental model has stepped out of the individual creator's head, out of the structural creation, and now into the cultural understanding. And of course, as it becomes culturally understood, there becomes a gravity, right? There's a certain concentration of ideas that align with this reified mental model. And then effectively, this creates people with the same or similar mental model. And so what happens is I develop a social media service that is similar to Twitter because I have a mental model that is similar to the cultural understanding of social media services, because Twitter is as popular as it is, or as Facebook is it's really not that popular anymore, actually. Was as popular as it was. And of course, when I mention this, it might sound like there's not a lot of room for deviance. I want to communicate here, as we look at the sort of the dashed blue lines, that in each of these there's a degree of interpretation that goes on. And in that interpretation, there becomes modulation. And it's actually really similar to the concept of memes that Dawkins has mentioned, that Dawkins developed when he did. And so in these structural creations, the past informs the present, as in I have mental models that are certainly informed by the things that I have interacted around me, which those things are informed by the mental models of their designer or designers. So then when I go to create something, or I go to try to influence change in some way, there are mental models at play that somebody who is even potentially dead might have had a hand in developing. And you can actually see this if you look at the way in which a lot of our tech billionaires are aspiring about the future. You can find that it's actually inspired by science fiction that was written at about the time that they were teenagers and beyond. So you can see it in sci-fi, what their aspirations might be, because, the person who wrote that specific science fiction book was fueled by certain mental models again, right? So there's this process of interpretation, but also this process of mental model input that fuels directly our understanding. And I'm going to stop sharing unless somebody has questions about this specific chart. And actually, one thing to bring up is that the way they are related, if I wasn't clear, is through this concept of mental models. So when it comes to trying to get to the level above understanding, whether it be anticipatory systems or structural systems, the way the ontological unit of a feature seems to be at the mental model level, rather than the anticipatory systems or the structural systems. It seems to be, if you can get at the mental model, if you can get at changing mental models, if you can get at understanding, deeply understanding mental models, that is your vectors for change within our understandings of the future. Now I don't know if David's hand raised was still raised, or if David has a different question to ask now.
I have a different question.
Yes, absolutely.
On your diagram. So,
yes.
So when it refines the mental models,
Mm-hmm.
and then from there it goes to gravity, is there a collective approach that refines the mental model? I mean, is this a shared activity with
Yes, it is.
different entities that kind of take the existing mental model, and then there's collaboration that's involved with the crowdsourcing or whatever, and then from that refines the mental model, which thus gives it gravity over?
So yes, that is the understanding. So I like to think of the reification as the initial moments of the mental model detaching from both the originator of the structure and the structure itself. So the moment that it is no longer possible to say that was an idea from so-and-so is when the reification officially happens. The gravity of that happens is exactly what you mentioned, which is this social process of almost crowdsourcing this meme, as it were, in which it gets slowly embedded in all of us in different ways. But it is through this social collaboration.
Okay, thanks. Is it any possible we'd be able to share those diagrams if you put it on Discord or whatever, if it's okay? Over.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll convert this to a PDF and I'll put it over in the Discord after the talk today.
Yeah, thank you, Austin.
Of course, thank you. Daniel is raising his hand.
Yeah, I'm very polite. I'm very polite that way.
Yeah. What's up?
I actually think it's really interesting to consider that transition from a mental model or a perspective to something that's reified, or like I like to think of it in terms of the habitus, right? So it becomes like a part of the way that we see the world, as opposed to a lens that we choose to see the world through.
Exactly.
And the destructuring of those things that can come from simply like pointing out that it is a perspective, which is one of the most powerful aspects of the DSRP method that I found, was the introduction of perspective.
Yes.
As an aspect of the system. Actually, Ben Zweibelson's work with drawing systems, now draw yourself in the system, and
right.
That me being a part of this system and therefore having a relationship between the structures that I'm seeing really reveals that, if I was somebody else, the system might look different, or this is just a perspective, as opposed to a reified, this is an ontology, right?
Yeah. What you highlight is kind of what I wanted to end with, which is there is a significant gravity towards trying to make futures as a practice closer to a natural science, which in a lot of ways can be useful, right? I'm not one to knock on the natural sciences, but where we get our collective understanding about the future is inherently from the social sciences. You can see it in Wendell Bell's work when he was, doing the historical work needed about trying to pinpoint when the formulation of future studies happened, that there's inherently a social science perspective that was at the formulation of futures as a practice that we need to ensure that we don't forget, because as we look at the reasons why the futures are plural, why this emergence does occur, is because we are humans who are interacting socially with one another. And these social rules that we follow are what create the fertilizer, if you will, for different things to happen. Of course, it's not the only thing. It is an aspect of why this emergence occurs, but it is, from our sort of anthropological point of view, one of the main reasons why so much divergence happens in our experiences, because we are social, because of our inherent interactions with one another. And that's kind of what I wanted to leave it off, was there is a social science here that we need to not forget when we talk about a futures practice, that it is yet to be explored in the way that it needs to be explored. And that's part of what I'm getting at when I mention structural systems, because this is inherently a part of the concept of habitus. It is inherently a part of the concept of many other things like means and so on and so forth. So I'll leave the last, I think we got 3 minutes for questions, thoughts, deviating points. Or if you just want to casually chat, I'm excited for that too. But just in case nobody has anything, thank you, everybody. It's always fun to talk about this. Chris, please. And then I see Ethan has their hand raised too.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about horizon scanning. You went in depth there, and then problem definition and Professor Hines' approach there, adding context and horizon together. One thing, as you were discussing trends and patterns, that I was kind of looking into and trying to figure out where was it going. We didn't really dive too deep into the problem definition aspect of that.
Oh, sure.
But it sounded like as you dove down into your take on patterns, we actually started nearing more toward that problem definition piece. And I was just wondering, is that more where you fall toward Hines or more toward the horizon scanning initially?
So my suggestion is to understand if we want to pull in a systems perspective, because I really like Checklin's work in this specific area, understanding the problem context, right? So when Checklin did his work on the soft systems methodology, he basically said that before you start doing anything, you need to understand the problem context. And that was a significant deviation from the hard systems methodology, which is just like, no, you just attack the problem, right? So there's a fundamental difference there when I mention a problem context versus a problem. So I am on the side of understanding the problem context or the environment of the problem. And you do that a number of ways, right? You do that through interviewing people who are in some way impacted by the object of study, whether that be EVs, like I mentioned before. You can also do it through direct observation if your problem context sort of dictates that. The specific methodologies that you would use to do that, I think, vary pretty widely, which is one of the reasons why I didn't talk about it too much. But the reason why they vary so much is because within the various research disciplines, each research discipline has a different way of understanding problem context before we go into solutioning in any type of way. So thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. Ethan, you had a question?
Yeah, Austin, thanks for the sort of like very wide ranging, lots of ground we covered.
Yes.
I there's lots of jumping off points. I think the thing that's sort of floats to the top for me is therefore like when do we feel confident that we've covered enough ground, right? Like if future is plural, infinite, right? Like when should we feel like, not like mission accomplished banners necessarily, but like what sense do you have when you get through a futuring activity, if you feel a lot of remaining discomfort, do you just decide we should keep going?
Right.
Or, right, there's the sort of Mark Twainism, like I've spent much of my life worrying about things, some of which have happened. And so like, is it, pessimist versus optimist, or like, can you, how do you self-assess your futures practice, I guess?
Yeah, when you get into the more concrete application of this, there's a couple of things that are really important to mention. Like I've already mentioned mental models, and again, we filter the world through our mental models, which means before I do anything, I am already biased. And so are you, and so is Chris, and so is Michael, and so is Philippe. Like we are all biased because that is the way we as humans experience the world, right? It's through this lens of mental models. So to answer part of your question, you should not do a futures practice by yourself, because there's going to be an inherent bias. And so by having a team of people to work with, I always use like a faulty filter analogy, which is like, imagine that you're trying to filter out as much bad stuff as possible. And so I have a filter, but it has, a decent sized hole in it. So that's obviously not going to work for my job, right? I'm going to need either to fix this hole, which from the perspective of this metaphor that I'm using isn't going to work, right? I can't fix that I see things through mental models, but I can start using other filters and offset sort of the holes, right? And so by offsetting the holes, we at least get a clearer picture. To answer your question of when done, only when you have this diverse team can you really get to what could be comfortably called a done. Because if it was just me doing a futures thing, it might leave, whoever I'm working with or for in a more optimistic scenario than should be reflected, right? Done can be measured in a number of ways, and it's really difficult to say in a futures practice. My work as a consultant immediately colors what I call done, because I have a statement of work for each project that I work, and I have to hand off whether or not I feel like I'm done, whether or not I have, done the exact 5 weeks of work that I said that was needed when I actually needed 7 or 8. Done can be measured, though, along the way. And I think that's more useful. Done, for instance, in problem definition is when the inclusion of other perspectives doesn't significantly change your understanding. Right? There's always going to be a little bit of like vacillating left and right in your understanding. But when your understanding, and you could do this through like a thematic analysis, for example, when your themes don't change, if we're going to use thematic analysis as the example, when your themes don't change significantly in the inclusion of, following interviewees or observations, for example, then you can reasonably call problem definition done and start moving on with the next steps. Same could be said for horizon scanning, which is in the course of horizon scanning, if these trends and patterns aren't changing significantly over the inclusion of new resources, it is a decent rule of thumb to say, okay, well, let's call this done. It starts getting trickier to call it done when we're like, okay, we can call these 2 steps reasonably done. When do you call scenarios done? And that's largely going to depend on how you do your practice. I call it done when I have done the work of crafting scenarios, which is an entirely other conversation of which ways you can craft a scenario, whether that be, through the work of a fiction writing team, or you get people who are involved with the problem context to craft the scenarios themselves. Whichever way you do it, there's a degree of analysis that happens after the fact. Calling that analysis done, I think, is always the difficult thing, right? Because futures are evolving over time, right? What we get in a futures practice is a snapshot. But the nature of these Perl futures is more like a movie. And in our practice, we're getting a snapshot. So the best thing that we can do is continually do this practice. Just unfortunately, with the way that my work works, is that I can only do it once. So I can only give snapshots. I can't give the full reel. So ideally, your work is never done. That's the best way to do it, right? That's the best way to reflect the nature of the future, which is just to have a futures team in your organization continually doing this work over time. That is not the case for a lot of people. Not a lot of organizations have a futures team, unfortunately. So that was a really roundabout way to answer some of the things that I felt you were hinting at, as well as some of the things you're directly saying.
Yeah, thanks. I was maybe hoping you would say, stop trying to be comfortable. Like, the future is inherently risky,
yes,
and uncertain. I also think that in this part of practice, I personally believe it's important to be transparently wrong rather than opaquely right.
Oh, sure.
Right, that all of these futures are going to have aspects of them that maybe we got right, and hopefully all of them will have aspects that we got wrong. Right, that the future should be more interesting than what we can conceive. But that how do we track our who are the best predictors, and do we is there sort of the curse of Madden? If you have a rock star year predicting the future, should you just sit on the bench because your performance can't possibly continue to be sustained at that high of a level? So I don't know, these ideas that regression toward the mean is the law of the land. How can we build in outcomes that allow this practice to be measured and tracked and the values be seen, rather than, what the hell are those guys doing over there? Those people doing over there? I don't see the value of that practice, because it's hard to communicate to presentists or people who want to know the ROI. That that's a much longer conversation, but appreciate the chance to ruminate over it.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that point that part of what I hope that I communicated, part of what liberates people from the idea of wanting to be right, is that the idea that it's impossible to be right. You might get lucky, a couple of times, but over a long enough time span, anyone who accurately predicts something is going to be wrong, especially as we look at longer and longer time spans. And so when I do scenarios with people, that's one of the first things I mention, which is we're not here to be right. We are here to deviate significantly from the present in interesting ways, using our understanding of the present and the past, as I've mentioned. I have two people with questions to say, so I'll go Daniel and Chris because that's the order they're in on my screen.
I almost feel like this is where it's really important to differentiate between prediction and forecasting, or and futures work, because if we understand that the future is currently almost, it's biased by the structures of the present and our perceptions, our mental models that exist, then we will tend towards a convergence on tracks towards potential futures. The ability to anticipate those is its own skill, but one of the cool things about futures is it can help us destructure the future.
Actually, I can't remember who it was. Somebody asked me how to define foresight versus futures. Foresight is that deviation between forecasting and in a futures practice. That's why it's called foresight, right? So forecasting are people trying to accurately predict a thing, and there's an entire tradition which is connected to future studies as a practice that exists, and there's really interesting work going on there.
But I almost feel like
foresight is that deviation, is that other side of decoupling, of deconstructing.
And there's power in the ability to generate futures that are not likely. So when I was thinking about seeing around corners, reading McGrath, one of the things she's advocating for is the identification of things that could be weak signal detection, about things that could be in the adjacent possible.
Yeah.
The knowledge that those things could be potentially available to us can help us shape the potential for what does happen. Okay. So whether our predictions are accurate or not, that a thing will happen, the identification of it as being something that is within the adjacent possible, informing action now, is what helps us destructure those what would otherwise be inevitable or highly likely outcomes. So the less likely, the weak signals are enormously important for us, and seeking accurate predictions, you're going to trend towards strong signals. I think that's my gut instinct. So
I have something to add to that, but I want to hear Chris first.
Oh, I don't want to take up any time. Mine's quick. It's not a question. One of the pieces I found that to me got to your intersection piece here with systems futures design was you mentioned what can you plan or control is what, something we're trying to do. In other words, what can you assure? What can you guarantee or hope to guarantee? Vice, what do you need to adapt to? So what is out of control, right? In that is the anticipatory piece. And I see a bit of intersection there just from my perspective. Also, shout out to AOD. Thanks, guys. And Austin, you crushed it.
Appreciate it. So yeah, there's a interesting amount of understanding that needs to happen, because you can look at scenarios as generating a new structural system, right? By generating a scenario that is completely divergent, or at least as divergent as possible from the future that we think is most possible, you're creating a new structural system. And as I mentioned with the flow of structural systems, these structural systems can be reified, right? They can then have gravity, and they can then create other people with this mental model. This is the other use that scenarios have. This is why sci-fi can be so powerful, is because they represent different ways in which you can create a structural system for either perpetuating what's currently happening or creating people who might think in a completely deviant way from what is established. Deviant not being a bad thing, just meaning different in this case. But I can probably stop in the interest of people's time. We are significantly over, and I apologize for that.
Thank you, Austin. So on behalf of AOD community and the AOD team, like you really, I think, open our eyes to all of the, I would say, theoretical tradition supporting foresight, and it's something that personally I really need to up my game. So if you could share like some of the references that you've been quoting in the Discord, that would be really useful. And for me, if you look at my previous work, what really resonated is the link between future and mental models and reification. Yes. I think it's impossible to escape our mental models and reification. So it's still this kind of important, let's say, work to suggest that we keep doing this future work so that we never let things be taken for granted. Exactly. And that's something that we, you were talking about sci-fi. With the game we developed, it's taking place in a scenario in the Arctic in 2040. And what we realize is that for a player to really feel embedded in this world, it has to fit partly with their mental models. Otherwise, the player is totally lost. So it really brought back to us a key takeaway for foresight is that even in your foresight, there will always be some aspect of the present, because if what you get from the foresight is so far away from your current mental models, it's going to be unintelligible for people. Mm-hmm. So anyways, it's just to say that even if we do that work and we need to do it, we still need to remain humble in the face of what the future can bring. So thank you so much again, Austin. And it was great to see so many people from Agitari here today and from AOD. So I think that we have a lot of point in common and shared interest. So we should definitely chat to see how we can do more stuff like that together and how we can collaborate. So thank you so much. And I wish you a happy holidays, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you and happy holidays.